evening to all our viewers. You're watching India Inc.'s Dream Budget right here on NDTV Profit, a show that encompasses the wish list of various sectors before the Finance Minister announces the budget on the 16th of March. Today in focus is the retail as well as the FMCG sector. Retail has been in the news of late with regards to opening up of multi-brand retail. The government has taken steps in the right direction by opening up single brand retail, but that too with a few other restrictions. In focus today is the retail space, and joining me to discuss the wish list, I've got with me Mr. A. Mahendran of Godrej Consumer Products, Mr. Rakesh Biyani of the Pantaloon Group, as well as Mr. Rohit Bhasin, who is joining me from PwC India. Gentlemen, thanks very much for joining. And Mr. Biyani, I want to start this off with you. Firstly, on the retail front, what are the key factors that the industry is looking at? What are the issues that the industry is facing that need redressal from the union budget?
I think over the last few months there has been a slowdown in the consumption, and we've seen the fact that there are not enough customers walking into the stores. More to do with, I think, the inflation, the interest costs, etc. So as the macroeconomic conditions improve, I hope that retail will ultimately move back upwards. But I think there are two key things which are significantly, of course, impacting the retail business. Apparel as a business is one of the largest business in the organized retail segment, and last year has been a really a year where we not only had high inflation on the raw material costs, but also a new tax in terms of excise duty which moved up from 0 to 10%, and that has actually led to a significant cut in the level of consumption in the apparels, and most of the apparel industry has suffered a big beating because there was a poor festive season, and then we've had record sales in discount periods, which has led to a very low margin realization. The apparel industry is clearly not in a position to sustain such kind of high pricing, and I think they put in a lot of representations to the government to say that if they could relook at the excise regime on apparels back to the original 0 or maybe even a 1% level, which is where more than 130 products are falling into. And clothing is a necessity, and I think it's very important that it goes back to that level, because coupled with the fact that there is free imports now out of Bangladesh, and pricing out of Bangladesh is actually quite low compared to India, because the cost of manufacturing there is low, wages are much lower in Bangladesh.
Right. Getting you there, just want to touch upon a particular aspect, which has been the competitiveness of the industry. Take, for example, the textile space itself. India, for that matter, is one of the leaders in textiles. But according to you, do you think that we're competitive enough right now? And what could be the push given if we're not, to help it out?
Unfortunately, over the years, textile being reserved for such small manufacturers has really not created the scale, and coupled with the high power cost and very high minimum wages that are being now prescribed across most states, it has become a little difficult to get the right costing. Whereas if you look at Bangladesh, which has really supported the textile industry and apparel today, I think Bangladesh is now exporting more apparel than what India is doing, and that has happened in less than 5 years out there. And to allow a 0% duty import out of Bangladesh, and at the same point time I'm having a 10% excise duty on local manufacturing. The issue is not about 10% excise. The issue is more to do with the excise is only restricted to the finished product, and almost all the raw materials are exempted, which means the fact that retailers like us are actually paying a tax of MRP based tax straight up front, right, whereas in the industry you don't even realize the MRP.
Mr. Mahendran, I want to bring it to you now. I mean, we've heard Mr. Biyani talk about what the finance minister could do for the retail sector. What would it take to make this budget a dream budget for the FMCG sector?
Introduction of GST, Goods and Services Tax. That's very critical, and in our opinion that this would go a long way in increasing the consumption, and as well as the consumer sector itself will be a big contributor to the GDP, and we feel that government should take definitely an aggressive posture and introduce the GST at the earliest. That's number one. Number two, we are looking at how the DTC, the direct tax code, also gets implemented as fast as possible, particularly in terms of the personal taxation, where the limits, if it can be accelerated and go up the limit can be increased from a basic exemption of 1.8 lakhs with a tax exemption can go up to 3 lakhs, and the maximum rate of tax, which is 30%, start from 8 lakhs, can also be extended to 10 lakhs. Now all these things will help in terms of disposable consumer surplus income, and which will help a lot in increasing consumption.
What I'm trying to also ask is, what has been the extent of the benefit brought to the industry by such measures, and this time around, what do you think could be the likely scope of these measures?
Extent will be definitely the disposable income, particularly at the bottom of the pyramid. When you look at that, the consumption will shoot up, and all the FMCG companies today are certainly relying on how the consumption will grow in bottom of the pyramid. So that's the reason where the individual taxation relief, if it can be expanded, that will be a big help.
I want to bring in Rohit here. Rohit, just carrying forward from Mr. Biani's point, particularly on the tax incentive side for the retail sector, what are you envisaging for this budget, particularly any clarity required on the excise duty front?
My wish list in a way from the excise duty would be that I think the excise duty that they introduced on branded apparel last year, that's something which should either be abolished completely or be brought down quite significantly, because I think that's taking up the input costs to the eventual buyer quite a lot. That's one. And I think another item is excise duty, if it can be brought down on jewelry, because jewelry can be quite a significant item for export for India, and especially if you're trying to give an impetus to branded jewelry in terms of quality, etc., rather than the jewelry sold by mom and pop shops, then that's something which is that if that is brought down, then that would be a big relief for the industry too.
Also, Rohit, I'm keeping it with you. There's also an expectation that they could tinker around with the MAT a bit from 18.5%, bring it down to 15%. If that does happen, how big a shot in the arm is this for the sector?
I think that clearly would be of significant help again.
Mr. Biani, looking at the policy side of things, we all know about FDI and multi-brand retail. That was given a pause button just some time back. Do you expect a mention of it back in the budget?
I think, without the support of the states, implementation of FDI is going to become difficult. So I think the process needs to be done through a consensus. It really does not need to go through the budget. I think, but what I would say is the fact that one of the most important things that needs to happen in budget for organized retail is a part to GST. What you're seeing is the fact that this country has been getting ready for a GST regime for almost 3 years now, and we've been introducing taxes across all product categories. There are so many products today where you don't only pay service tax, but you're also paying VAT. Secondly, I think FDI is more important because in this country, in our country, the consumption is only going to go up. The aspirations are going up, the needs for new products is very high, and without an organized retail, which will ultimately lead to better efficiencies in the supply chain, we may not be able to cater to those consumption, and which could ultimately mean the fact that inflation would be there forever. So I think in a simple manner, FDI can help investment in supply chain, which could ultimately lead to a lower price and fulfillment of those growing aspiration among the middle class of India.
The other bit, Mr. Biani, that you yourself pointed out, and I'd like to touch upon that again, and probably, talk a little bit more on clarity required for GST as well as DTC. Currently, that is a little bit of an area which everyone is wishing for, that some clarity will come out in the budget. What's the status here?
I think unfortunately it requires a national consensus to get a GST in place, because it's a big constitutional change. And I think what I can only say is the fact that whatever we've heard about the Empowered Committee, and which is being led by Sushil Modi now, and they seem to have arrived at a consensus and they are likely to move forward. What I'm also told is the fact that sometime later this year the infrastructure to implement GST would be in place, and if there is support from across the board, because at the end this is for the better of the country. Whenever I talk to a lot of overseas people, and it's become kind of a laughing stock today, saying the fact that every single year you have a postponement. When is this big tax reform going to ever happen?
Mr. Mahendran, I want to come back on the FMCG side and talk a little bit more on the taxation bit. There's an anticipation that Section 33A, which specifies tax exemptions for processing tea, could now be extended to other products as well. What are your thoughts on this?
I think in our expectation always the tax incentives, particularly the FMCG sector, is not very supportive, and the government should look at that as far as that is concerned. But more so, we are more concerned that the current rumors that the excise duty would also get increased from current level of 10% to 12%. And to my mind, that should not be done. And it can be only worsen the scenario with a high inflationary situation today. What we went through, even though it's slightly moderated today, it will again invigorate that.
And you also mentioned, Mr. Mahendran, about some relief from the excise duty front. Do you think that the excise duty increase of 200 basis point, the cut that we saw as a part of the stimulus package, could be reinstated in this budget?
That is the fear we have. But the question is what finally the budget will be. One has to see what happens. But our expectation is we should not get more burden today at this juncture, because of the various commodity prices, how it is going shooting up in the last 2 years. It's going to be a serious concern for us.
Gentlemen, I'm just going to put a pause to that thought for 2 minutes. Need to take a break right here on the show, but coming right back in a few moments to discuss the exhaustive wish list. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Mr. Biani, while we've spoken about FDI and multi-brand retail and you've shared your views with us, the government took a step in the right direction by opening up FDI in single brand retail, but that too had a caveat with the mandate of 30% outsourcing from SEZs. That requires more clarity, right, in this budget?
Well, I think, when you think about categories in the luxury end of the market, where it was really single brand was really meant for the luxury end of the market, it's going to be difficult for people to get attracted to 100% FDI. It's not easy to just start sourcing out of small scale manufacturers when you're producing a luxury product. So I think that is going to be difficult, but neither in the long run, I think the process of defining 30% was the right thing to do, but it could have been done in a staged manner, which rather over the years maybe it should have been done. But personally, I believe the fact that the easier path to FDI opening up should have had been that to define it at a category level and including multi-brand or single brand, because this is the only country in the world which kind of defines an industry based on the number of brands that you sell and not specific to the category. There are a number of categories which are not going to impact any of the marketplace or any of the existing players in India, which could have easily have been opened up. So I just hope the fact that the government, if it's not able to create a consensus towards opening FDI across all multi-brand category products, could at least open it up for certain sectors. Maybe it's the electronics, maybe it's the sports, so maybe it's the home improvement segments which require definite investment, as there is there's going to be a lot more consumption to happen in these segments.
Rohit, you want to comment on that? Some more clarity on single brand retail?
Huge amount of expectation on that there should be an announcement, or at a minimum the path forward in terms of timelines for the multi-brand retail FDI opening up to the extent of 51% that had earlier been announced by the finance minister. Also in terms of talking to people who are interested in the single brand investments, I think there are challenges which are being seen on the 30% sourcing requirement from SMEs. So my personal take on that would be that there should be a clarification, and hopefully if you can do away with the 30% sourcing requirements, particularly from the SME sector, because certain sectors like luxury goods etc. would find it extremely difficult to get what they need from the SME sector. So maybe they can specify that it should be from sourcing from India rather than specifying that it should be from the SME sector.
Mr. Mahendran, for the FMCG sector particularly, aside of what we've discussed that could come under the scope of the budget, there's one particular aspect which is weighing down heavily on the industry, and that's inflation, high inflation. What's your own sense? I mean, this is obviously something that is beyond the scope of the budget, which needs immediate addressal.
Correct. I agree. But you see, apart from the budget, we are also, the current trends are the liquidity squeeze is heading, and the interest rates are pretty high, and those moderation of that would help a lot. But apart from that, the consumer sector, particularly FMCG, would be definitely helped a lot if the FDI part of it gets a clear direction and gets into an implementation phase immediately after the budget. So that's very keen as FMCG sector is looking forward for that.
Another aspect would be funding. Is that a problem? Is that an issue for the industry right now, or that's not too much of an issue?
It should be addressed definitely, and that fear is looming on us for the last 3 years. And if government could address that, it would help a lot from our sector point of view. Yes.
Another point, Mr. Mahendran, that you mentioned was about rural infrastructure. Now, since you mentioned it, I want to go ahead and ask you whether the industry is expecting a revision under Section 80IA, in the definition of infrastructure, which could probably include even rural infrastructure.
That's not, at the moment, issue. It is not an issue. But from a funding point of view, I would like to touch base on the rural sector. And all the FMCG players in industry have embarked very ambitiously in the last 2 years or 3 years of building infrastructure to address rural consumption. And of course, the sustenance of NREGA and other schemes which the government has done, which there is a fear that because of the fiscal deficit, etc., it could be withdrawn or reduced, etc. So that can affect the rural consumption.
Mr. Biyani, for the retail side, there's been a want for granting the industry status. You think it needs to have more proactive states rather than just a push from the center?
Well, I don't know. When I hear what the IT industry has to say, saying the fact that don't even look for an industry status because that means more regulation, etc. But personally, if you ask me, retail is a trading business, and a large chunk of the trading is really a state subject. So unless the state governments, do not look at it as an avenue to increase their revenues and put in the right side of policies in their own states to ensure that retail can grow, it's not going to happen. So I don't know, if this becomes an industry status, will the state governments look at it? But to me, really, it's no center can just be an influencer, but it's really the states which control what is going to happen in retail.
Rohit, do you agree with Mr. Biyani here that you need more proactive states rather than just the center giving the push?
Well, I would clearly support what Mr. Biyani is saying. This is something, it's a retail sector, something which should be awarded an industry status. Because particularly I think that's when we will see a certain amount of incentives which can come in for the back-end supply chain, notably cold storages and mobile refrigerated vans. So that's clearly a demand which is sort of long pending, and if that comes in this budget, that's going to be absolutely important for the retail sector.
Mr. Mahendran, bring you in again. And taking the topic of excise duty forward, I know this is probably not applicable to your company, but every time we talk about the budget, there's one aspect for the FMCG sector on the excise duty front that we talk about, and that is the excise duty on cigarettes. This time also there's an anticipation that it could be raised further by 10%. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. If that is done, it will really be a big help from our sector point of view. But as you are suggesting, there are many more things if government is more proactive. And how do we increase the overall consumption of consumer sector, which includes not only FMCG, it includes entertainment, it includes durables and everything. If you put together, I've been informed that it will be the share of consumer sector will be at least 2.5% of the GDP. So that's a big number, and the government should be more proactive towards that.
Coming back to Rohit, one last word from you. There are some other expectations of a formal retail policy to come about, formation of an REZs like just how we have SEZs, and also a VAT refund talk could be got under consideration for making the Indian retail segment even more lucrative. What is your opinion?
Yes, absolutely, but I don't think it will come in this budget. But if it can come, then again that's something which would be very important for the retail sector, because I think quality space is something which is a big constraint in India. And again, if you're encouraging tourism, then why not VAT refunds too? Because we do have a plethora of taxes and we haven't been able to see the light of GST and the direct tax code yet. So a specific initiative such as the REZ would again go a long way in terms of redefining parameters and in providing impetus to growth for the retail and consumer sector.
All right, completely running out of time here, but have to get that one last word. And Mr. Mahendran, I'll come to you for it. What is that one thing that you want to hear from the Finance Minister for the FMCG sector?
That's what the rumors we are hearing about it. As far as cigarettes is concerned, the government would try to increase that. But one has to wait and watch, see it. But then we wouldn't like to comment that the cigarette industry should be increased or anything like that. But certainly it's the government's call. But the information to my mind is yes. As I said earlier, I repeat that what is the one thing which we as FMCG player waiting for is the introduction of GST at the earliest. That will be the most important.
All right, with that we come to the end of this special show with the focus on the retail as well as the FMCG sector and what their wish list is for the union budget and what the Finance Minister could give out to the industry. Thanks, gentlemen, Mr. Mahendran, Mr. Biyani as well as Mr. Basim. Thank you so very much for joining in. That's a goodbye from me. Thanks a lot for watching.